A decoded message changed the course of history. As spring turned to summer in 1942, the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance while two brilliant minds, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, plotted their next moves in a high-stakes naval chess match. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood on the balcony of his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, gazing out at the remnants of America's devastated Pacific Fleet. 6 months earlier, the tranquil Sunday morning of December 7th had erupted into chaos as Japanese bombs rained down, leaving the harbor a graveyard of twisted metal and broken ships. Now, Nimitz held a paper that might just give America its first real chance to strike back. Midway, he whispered to himself. He's coming for Midway. Across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, sat in his quarters aboard the massive battleship Yamamoto. His calligraphy brush moved with practiced precision across rice paper as he drafted his most ambitious plan. Yet, the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide, claiming victory after victory. But Yamamoto knew better than to celebrate. A Harvard-educated strategist who had spent years in America, he understood his enemy's industrial might and determination. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he had allegedly warned, after Pearl Harbor. Now he sought to finish what he had started before American production could turn the tide. According to the Naval Institute proceedings, Yamamoto's strategy was bold but necessary. Lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where overwhelming Japanese naval power would crush them once and for all. The tiny atoll of Midway, just 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, would be the perfect trap. What Yamamoto couldn't know was that American codebreakers had accomplished the impossible. Station Hypo, under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had cracked portions of the Japanese naval code JN-25. Working around the clock in an underground bunker nicknamed the Dungeon, Rochefort and his team of linguistic geniuses pieced together fragments of Japanese communications. When they intercepted messages referring to a target designated as AF, Rochefort became convinced this was Midway. To prove his theory, he devised an ingenious trap. Midway would send an uncoded message claiming their water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The confirmation gave Nimitz the priceless gift of advance warning. "Gentlemen," Nimitz told his gathered staff on May 27th, "we have the opportunity for the greatest reversal in naval history." His blue eyes gleamed with intensity. "But only if we act with perfect timing." The stakes could not have been higher. If Midway fell, Hawaii would be directly threatened. The west coast of America would lie exposed. But Nimitz faced a terrible dilemma. His forces were vastly outnumbered. Yamamoto commanded a massive armada, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 14 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and support vessels. Against this juggernaut, Nimitz could deploy only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Coral Sea battle. As recounted in Miracle at Midway by Gordon Prange, Nimitz made a crucial decision. Rather than defending Midway conventionally, he would position his carriers northeast of the island, hiding them from the approaching Japanese. If fortune favored him, American planes could strike the Japanese carriers while their decks were crowded with aircraft preparing to attack Midway. On the morning of June 3, 1942, as the vast Japanese fleet steamed eastward through foggy seas, confidence ran high. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and never tasted defeat. His 4 powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the spear point of Japanese naval might, their flight, decks bustling with preparations as over 200 aircraft were readied. In Hawaii, Nimitz bid farewell to his carrier commanders. To Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had replaced the ill William Halsey as commander of Task Force 16, Nimitz gave simple instructions. "You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk." No one knew that within 72 hours, the ID balance of power in the Pacific would be irrevocably altered by decisions made in frantic moments aboard swaying carrier decks. Dawn broke over Midway on June 4, 1942, painting the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. Lieutenant Howard 80 piloted his PBY Catalina patrol plane through wispy clouds, scanning the vast ocean below. At precisely 5:25 a.m., his voice crackled over the radio. Enemy carriers sighted. The battle that would change the course of the Pacific War had begun. Admiral Nagumo, aboard his flagship Akagi, projected supreme confidence as he ordered the launch of the first wave, 108 bombers and fighters, toward Midway. His plan followed the same proven template that had brought victory at Pearl Harbor: an initial airstrike to neutralize enemy aircraft and installations, followed by successive waves that would pound the target into submission before an amphibious invasion. What troubled some of his staff officers, however, was Yamamoto's complicated battle plan, which had dispersed the Japanese fleet across hundreds of miles of ocean. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had helped design the Pearl Harbor attack, had argued against this dispersal. "We should keep our forces concentrated, Admiral," he had warned during planning sessions. But Yamamoto's strategy prevailed. A feint toward the Aleutian Islands in Alaska would divide American attention, while the main force converged on Midway from multiple directions. According to historian John Toland in The Rising Sun, this complex approach reflected Yamamoto's background as a gambling enthusiast who approached warfare with a gambler's boldness. The admiral was playing for the highest stakes imaginable, the future of the Pacific War. As Japanese planes streaked toward Midway, the island's defenders prepared for the onslaught. Marine Fighter Squadron, VMF 221, scrambled its obsolete Buffalo fighters to intercept, but they were hopelessly outmatched by the superior Japanese Zero fighters. Major Floyd Parks radioed simply, "There are too many Zeros. There's nothing we can do," before his plane plunged into the sea. On Midway itself, 19-year-old Private First Class George Mayer huddled in a foxhole as Japanese bombs transformed the airfield into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel. "The ground shook like an earthquake," he would later recall in an interview with the National World War II Museum. "The noise was beyond description. Explosions, anti-aircraft guns, planes diving. It felt like the end of the world." Despite the ferocity of the attack, the Japanese failed to knock out Midway's airfield. Moreover, American bombers from the island had already launched desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers. Though these uncoordinated strikes caused no damage, they alerted Nagumo to an unexpected level of resistance. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the northeast, Admiral Spruance aboard USS Enterprise made the most momentous decision of his career. Having learned the location of Nagumo's carriers, he ordered an immediate all-out attack, even though his aircraft would be at the very limit of their range and might not have enough fuel to return. "The whole war in the Pacific could depend on what we do in the next few hours," he told his operations officer. As recounted in The Battle of Midway by Craig Simons at 7:55 a.m., American carrier planes began launching into the blue Pacific sky. Pilots climbed into their Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo bombers, and Wildcat fighters with the knowledge that they might not return. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, told his men, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." Back on the Japanese carriers, a fateful debate raged. Scouts had reported American ships in the area, but the reports were confusing and incomplete. Nagumo faced a critical decision. His aircraft had returned from bombing Midway and needed to be rearmed. Should he prepare them for another strike on the island, or arm them with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacks on American ships that might or might not be in the vicinity? After agonizing deliberation, Nagumo ordered his aircraft rearmed for another strike on Midway. Then at 8:20 a.m., a more definitive sighting report arrived. American carriers had been spotted. Nagumo reversed his decision, ordering the planes to be rearmed again with anti-ship weapons, a process that would take precious time and leave his flight decks crowded with munitions and fuel lines. It was precisely in this moment of vulnerability, with Japanese flight decks cluttered with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, that American planes arrived overhead. The first to attack were the slow, obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers. Flying straight and level to launch their torpedoes, they were easy prey for the Zero fighters. Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 was annihilated. Of 15 planes and 30 men, only Ensign George Gay survived, watching the subsequent battle while floating in the ocean. But their sacrifice was not in vain. 10 minutes after 10 in the morning, the course of the Pacific War changed in just 5 extraordinary minutes. As the Japanese fighters were drawn down to sea level to slaughter the American torpedo bombers, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise appeared overhead, having flown beyond their expected fuel range in search of the enemy. McCluskey had made a critical decision to continue searching when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer steaming at full speed, correctly guessing it was heading toward the main Japanese force. Now, looking down from 18,000 feet, McCluskey saw the panorama of war spread beneath him. 4 Japanese carriers sailing in a loose box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft and ordnance. The American dive bombers plunged from the sun like avenging angels. Captain Miles Browning, Admiral Spruance's chief of staff, had predicted this perfect scenario in briefings. If we time it right, we'll catch them with their pants down, fueling and arming on deck. According to Walter Lord's acclaimed account, incredible victory, Japanese lookouts finally spotted the American dive bombers when they began their near-vertical plunges. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as the first bombs fell. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was now grounded with appendicitis, later wrote, "The terrifying scream of the dive bombers reached me first, followed by the crashing explosion of a direct hit. Looking through my binoculars, I witnessed a horrible sight. Lieutenant Richard Best selected the flagship Akagi for his attack. His 1,000-pound bomb smashed through the flight deck and exploded among fueled and armed aircraft below. Within moments, secondary explosions ripped through the carrier." From his command post, Admiral Yamamoto, miles away on the battleship Yamato, received the unthinkable news. 3 of his 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were ablaze from stem to stern. On USS Enterprise, jubilant radar operators tracked the battle. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, who had developed the Thatch-Weave fighter tactic specifically to counter the superior Japanese Zero, returned from the battle and reported breathlessly, "They're burning. By God, they're burning." The tide had turned, but the battle wasn't over. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that left the American carrier Yorktown badly damaged. However, late that afternoon, American dive bombers found and bombed Hiryu into a floating inferno. The Chicago Tribune, somewhat controversially at the time, reported, "Such a reversal of fortune in so short a time has few parallels in military history. In less than 5 minutes, Japan's strategic advantage in the Pacific was obliterated." In his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received the news with characteristic restraint. "Tell the men well done," he said simply, though he understood immediately the historic significance of what had transpired. Later, in private correspondence uncovered by historian Ronald Spector, Nimitz wrote, "It was divine intervention, plus excellent intelligence, superb airmanship, and the fighting heart of our men." For the Japanese command, the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Admiral Yamamoto, the strategic mastermind who had planned for every contingency, faced the unthinkable. His main carrier force, the striking arm of Japanese naval power, had been decimated in a single day. He reluctantly ordered a general withdrawal, abandoning the Midway operation entirely. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida later recalled in his memoir that when he met with Yamamoto after the battle, the admiral sat in somber silence for several minutes before speaking. "I made a terrible mistake," Yamamoto finally said. "We should never have started this war. The catastrophe at Midway revealed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese naval operations. Their carriers operated without adequate coordination. Their damage control procedures were inferior to American methods, and their intelligence gathering had failed to detect the waiting American carriers. Most critically, they had lost 4 frontline carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, men with thousands of flight hours who had trained for years and proven their skills from China to Pearl Harbor." As darkness fell on June 4th, Fires still illuminated the horizon where proud Japanese carriers had sailed that morning. Aboard the American carriers, exhausted pilots who had witnessed both terrible losses and miraculous victory tried to make sense of what they had experienced. Lieutenant Commander John Lundstrom recorded in his diary, "We knew we had won something important, but none of us understood yet how this day would be remembered." The tide of war had turned in a single afternoon, marking the first major Japanese naval defeat in more than 300 years. In the aftermath of Midway, both Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the profound challenge of adapting to a transformed strategic reality. The battle had been more than a clash of ships and planes. It represented a pivotal contest between opposing philosophies of command and contrasting national approaches to warfare. Nimitz, safely back at Pearl Harbor, crafted a deliberately understated communique announcing the victory. Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. Privately, he understood the full magnitude of what had occurred. In a confidential assessment sent to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, Nimitz wrote, "The battle has given us breathing space but not security. We remain outnumbered in all categories except courage." This combination of quiet confidence and clear-eyed realism exemplified Nimitz's leadership style. According to David Rigby's Allied Master Strategists, Nimitz possessed an extraordinary ability to select the right commanders for critical roles, and then trust them to execute their missions without micromanagement. His decision to place Admiral Raymond Spruance in command of Task Force 16 just days before the battle exemplified this gift. Spruance, primarily a cruiser commander with limited carrier experience, had nonetheless demonstrated the precise qualities Nimitz valued: analytical thinking, calm under pressure, and moral courage. Aboard his flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto struggled with a very different command reality. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated under a rigid hierarchical system that concentrated authority at the top. Naval historian H.P. Wilmot noted in an article for the U.S. Naval War College Review that Yamamoto created a plan so complex and compartmentalized that when circumstances changed, his subordinate commanders lacked the flexibility or authority to adapt effectively. The psychological impact of the defeat weighed heavily on Yamamoto. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, his chief of staff, later revealed in an interview with the Pacific War Research Society that the admiral barely slept in the weeks following Midway, often pacing the deck at night. "I sensed for the first time that he understood Japan could not win this war," Watanabe confided. Nimitz, meanwhile, demonstrated remarkable emotional resilience. Rear Admiral Edwin Layton, his intelligence officer, recalled finding the admiral tending to his garden the weekend after the battle. "He told me that gardening reminded him that growth requires both sunshine and rain, both good days and bad," Layton wrote in his memoir, "And I was there." This philosophical equanimity would prove crucial in the long war ahead. Both commanders now faced the challenge of rebuilding. For Nimitz, this meant capitalizing on the victory while acknowledging America's continuing material shortcomings. In July 1942, he authorized the first limited offensive operations in the Solomon Islands, beginning at Guadalcanal. This decision reflected his understanding that America needed to maintain momentum, while its industrial machine ramped up production of ships, planes, and weapons. For Yamamoto, the rebuilding task was far more daunting. Japan had lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and hundreds of elite aviators who could not be quickly replaced. According to Robert Cressman's A Glorious Page in Our History, the admiral told Emperor Hirohito, "We must adapt our strategy to a protracted defensive war until our training and construction programs can restore our strength." The New York Times military analyst Hanson Baldwin would later write, "Midway revealed the contrasting command philosophies that would shape the Pacific War. Nimitz created a system that leveraged American strengths: adaptability, individual, initiative, and technical problem-solving. Yamamoto remained bound to a system that emphasized perfect planning and unquestioning execution, effective when things went according to plan, catastrophic when they did not. This fundamental difference extended to how each commander processed information. Nimitz had created an intelligence apparatus that valued diverse inputs and encouraged debate. Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysts at Station Hypo felt empowered to challenge conventional wisdom when evidence warranted. By contrast, Japanese intelligence often suffered from confirmation bias, filtering information to match preconceived strategic assumptions. The human cost of these command decisions weighed differently on each admiral. From surviving correspondence, analyzed by historian Thomas Buell, Nimitz appeared particularly affected by the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons. He personally wrote condolence letters to dozens of families, often adding handwritten notes to the standard text. One letter to the parents of Ensign John Liska of Torpedo Squadron 8 read, "Your son's squadrons flew against overwhelming odds, knowing the danger, but determined to strike a blow for their country regardless of personal cost. America will never forget." Yamamoto's response to the human toll reflected Japanese military culture's different relationship with sacrifice. In a message to the combined fleet, he praised the warrior spirit of the fallen but emphasized that their deaths imposed an obligation on survivors to train harder and fight more fiercely. There was no public acknowledgement of strategic error or command failure. As summer turned to fall in 1942, both commanders wrestled with the battle's implications. Nimitz, the methodical Texan, began planning a long, systematic advance across the Pacific. Yamamoto, the poetic samurai, sought one more decisive battle to reverse Japan's fortunes. Neither could have predicted how their personal contest would end. Yamamoto shot down in flames over Bougainville less than a year later, targeted specifically because American intelligence had broken his travel codes. Nimitz surviving to accept Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. By September 1942, the strategic implications of Midway had begun to manifest across the vast Pacific theater. What started as a tactical victory, the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers, had evolved into a pivot point that reshaped the entire war. From the Solomon Islands to the halls of power in Washington and Tokyo, the battle's aftershocks continued to reverberate. For Admiral Tao, Nimitz Midway provided more than just a military victory. It granted him the precious commodity of credibility. Before the battle, many in Washington had questioned whether a defensive strategy centered on aircraft carriers could succeed against Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance. The Army Air Corps had advocated for resources to be concentrated on bombing campaigns from Australia. General Douglas MacArthur had pressed for priority to be given to his forces in the Southwest Pacific. Midway silenced these debates. As recorded, in the minutes of the Joint Chiefs of Staff meetings from July 1942, Admiral Ernest King effectively leveraged the victory to secure support for Nimitz's proposed island-hopping strategy. "Gentlemen," King reportedly declared, "the carrier task forces have proven their worth as the primary offensive weapon in the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz's approach has been vindicated. I propose we give him the resources he needs to build on this success." According to the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Sea of Thunder by Evan Thomas, President Roosevelt was particularly impressed by how Nimitz had managed the battle from afar, trusting his commanders while providing clear strategic guidance. "This is the kind of leadership we need," Roosevelt told his cabinet. "Bold when boldness is called for, prudent when prudence is required." Across the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto faced a radically different political reality. Imperial Navy spokesman Captain Hirade Yuzuru publicly proclaimed Midway a tactical setback, but assured the Japanese people that our advance toward final victory continues unabated. Privately, however, senior naval officers recognized the catastrophic nature of the defeat. The diary of Marquis Kido Koichi, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal and Emperor Hirohito's closest advisor, revealed the emperor's growing concern. On June 25, 1942, Kido recorded, "His Majesty inquired specifically about aircraft carrier construction schedules and pilot training programs. He seemed deeply troubled by the answers he received. Japan's industrial capacity simply could not replace the losses sustained at Midway quickly enough to maintain naval parity with the United States. American shipyards were launching new Essex-class carriers at the rate of almost 1 per month by 1943. Japan, by contrast, completed only 5 fleet carriers between Midway and the end of the war. The human dimension of this production disparity was equally significant. As naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison noted in History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, American pilot training programs expanded exponentially after Midway, while maintaining rigorous standards. By contrast, Japan began shortening its pilot training programs to rush replacements to the front, creating a downward spiral in the quality of its naval aviation. On the front lines, the psychological impact of Midway transformed how both forces approached combat. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had flown at Midway and continued serving in the Solomon Islands campaign, wrote in his wartime journal, "Before Midway, we respected the Japanese pilot as nearly supernatural, the Imperial Japanese Superman. We called him. After Midway, we still respected his skill, but we knew he could be beaten." Japanese records captured after the war revealed a corresponding crisis of confidence. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, wrote a confidential assessment for the Naval General Staff in August 1942. "Our pilots still believe in their individual superiority, but they have lost faith in our strategic doctrine. They question whether we can win a war of attrition against American industrial might." The Washington Post correspondent Robert Sherrod, who covered the Pacific War, observed, "Midway did more than change the military balance of power. It altered how each side viewed the other. Americans gained confidence that would never again be shaken. Japanese certainty of victory was replaced by a creeping doubt that would only grow with time." Perhaps most significantly, Midway forced fundamental changes in Japanese strategy. The original war plan had called for establishing a defensive perimeter in the Pacific, then negotiating from a position of strength. After Midway, as documented in papers from the Japanese War Cabinet, analyzed by historian Akira Irie, Imperial, planners began preparing for a long war of attrition they knew they could not win. Admiral Nimitz, by contrast, could now plan confidently for an offensive strategy. In October 1942, he submitted to the Joint Chiefs what became known as the Central Pacific Drive Plan. This document, preserved in the National Archives, outlined a methodical campaign to neutralize Japanese strongholds through a combination of amphibious landings and carrier air power. The strategy that would ultimately lead to Tokyo began taking shape within months of Midway. Both commanders recognized that the nature of naval warfare had fundamentally changed. On December 1, 1942, Nimitz issued a directive to all Pacific Fleet commanders stating, "The aircraft carrier, not the battleship, must be considered the centerpiece of our naval formations. All operations should be planned with this principle in mind." Yamamoto issued a similar directive to the combined fleet, though with evident reluctance, as he had begun his career as a battleship officer. By the close of 1942, the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. While fierce fighting continued on Guadalcanal and would rage across the Pacific for nearly 3 more years, the outcome had been determined in those 5 minutes above the Japanese carriers on the morning of June 4th. As British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later observed in a message to President Roosevelt, "Midway will rank with Trafalgar and Jutland in determining the freedom of the seas." As the war progressed into 1943 and beyond, the contrasting leadership legacies of Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto became increasingly apparent. Their decisions at Midway had not only shaped the outcome of a crucial battle, but established command paradigms that would influence military thinking for generations to come. Admiral Nimitz survived the war to become one of America's most revered naval leaders. His methodical approach to warfare, what naval historian Jeffrey Till called aggressive patience, became a cornerstone of U.S. naval doctrine. In a speech at Annapolis in 1960, Fleet Admiral William Halsey reflected, "What made Nimitz exceptional wasn't flashy brilliance or dramatic gestures. It was his consistent good judgment, his willingness to listen, and his ability to remain calm in crisis. These qualities saved the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor and led us to victory at Midway." For Yamamoto, fate delivered a much different epilogue. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted messages revealing the Admiral's planned inspection tour to forward bases in the Solomon Islands. In a mission codenamed Operation Vengeance, 16 P-38, Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft near Bougainville. The admiral died as his plane crashed into the jungle. Emperor Hirohito awarded him a posthumous promotion to fleet admiral and led the nation in mourning. According to historians at the Naval War College, the contrasting fates of these commanders reflected deeper truths about their respective nations' approaches to war. Nimitz represented America's greatest strength, the ability to create systems that didn't depend on irreplaceable individuals, wrote Professor Thomas Cutler. Yamamoto embodied Japan's fatal weakness, over-reliance on exceptional individuals, who could not be replaced when lost. The Atlantic Monthly published a comparative analysis in 1955 noting that Nimitz built an organizational culture that encouraged initiative at all levels, allowing subordinates like Spruance, Halsey, and Mitcher to develop their own leadership styles while adhering to common strategic principles. The Japanese Navy, after Yamamoto's death, fractured into competing factions without a unifying vision. Veterans of Midway carried its lessons throughout their careers. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded Task Force 16 during the battle, later became president of the Naval War College, where he emphasized the importance of adaptability over rigid planning. In a lecture preserved in the college archives, Spruance told midshipmen, "At Midway, we had the tremendous advantage of knowing what the enemy planned to do. But even perfect intelligence is worthless without commanders willing to act decisively on it." The seeds planted at Midway continued to bear fruit long after the war ended. In 1955, the U.S. Naval Tactical Doctrine publication explicitly cited the battle as demonstrating the decisive impact of intelligence advantage. Combined with tactical flexibility, Japanese post-war naval reform similarly reflected lessons learned from the disaster, particularly regarding command decentralization and intelligence processing. Time magazine, in a 25th anniversary retrospective on Midway published in 1967, observed, "What makes Midway eternally fascinating is not just the dramatic reversal of fortune, but how clearly it illustrates the human element in warfare. Technology, weapons, and numbers matter enormously, but ultimately, war is decided by human beings making decisions under pressure." Perhaps the most profound legacy of Midway was how it shaped the national narratives of both countries. For Americans, it became a story of resilience and ingenuity, overcoming overwhelming odds, a narrative that resonated deeply with American self-conception. For Japan, Midway eventually came to represent the dangers of overconfidence and the folly of military adventurism. Retired Japanese Vice Admiral Toshiyuki Yokoi, in a 1972 interview with the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, reflected, "We studied Yamamoto's leadership after the war not to repeat his strategic errors, but to recapture his moral courage and intellectual honesty. He knew from the beginning that war with America was unwinnable, yet when ordered to plan it, he did so with all his considerable skill. This paradox, serving faithfully while recognizing the likely futility of one's actions, contains an important lesson about duty." American naval officer and historian Edwin P. Hoyt wrote in How They Won the War in the Pacific that Nimitz's greatest contribution may have been emotional rather than strategic. He restored confidence when it was most needed, after the devastating blow of Pearl Harbor. Midway was as much a triumph of renewed American self-belief as it was of arms. As the 20th century progressed, military academies around the world continued to study the battle and its commanders. The contrast between Yamamoto's complex, intricately synchronized plan and Nimitz's flexible approach that empowered subordinate commanders became a standard case study in military decision-making. The United States Naval Academy at Annapolis established the Nimitz Lecture Series on leadership, while Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force Academy introduced ethics courses examining Yamamoto's moral dilemmas as an officer who opposed a war he was ordered to fight. On the 50th anniversary of the battle in 1992, surviving veterans from both sides gathered at the Naval Memorial in Washington, D.C. Former enemies, now elderly men, shook hands under the monument's soaring arches. Retired Japanese pilot Zenji Abe, who had flown from the carrier Akagi, told reporters, "We were all doing our duty as we understood it. The tragedy is that duty led us to fight each other." Beside him stood former Lieutenant George Gay, the sole IE, survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. "There's no bitterness anymore," Gay said. just respect for brave men on both sides, and gratitude that I lived to see this day of reconciliation. The New York Times covered the reunion with the headline, "At Midway Memorial, former foes find common ground in honoring sacrifice." The article concluded, "The legacy of commanders like Nimitz and Yamamoto ultimately transcends national boundaries. Their decisions at Midway shaped not just the outcome of a battle or even a war, but the peace that followed. In studying how they led, one to victory, one to defeat, we learn timeless lessons about the burden of command and the price of conflict. As the Pacific Ocean continues to gain strategic importance in the 21st century, the lessons of Midway remain relevant. Modern naval strategists still debate the balance between technological advantage and human judgment, centralized control and operational flexibility, comprehensive planning and adaptability to changing circumstances. The decisions made by two remarkable admirals in those fateful days of June 1942 continue to inform these discussions, ensuring that Midway remains not just a pivotal battle in world history, but an enduring case study in leadership at the highest stakes imaginable. In the final analysis, perhaps Admiral Nimitz himself best summarized the battle's significance. When asked years later about the key to victory at Midway, he replied with characteristic simplicity, "We had better intelligence, dedicated sailors and airmen, and just enough luck. But above all, we had leaders at every level who weren't afraid to make difficult decisions when the moment demanded action." In those words lies the most important lesson of Midway, that even in an age of machines and mass production, warfare remains fundamentally human.